to different times, and I think that as well, these same portals and windows could also take you to parallel realities. There have been cases, and I can't. This was in what was it? I think it was either the late 1950s or early 1960s. A guy who was on a passenger jet that came into Tokyo, and he had a passport to a country that didn't exist. It looked like an official passport. He claimed he was from this country. It was located somewhere in Europe, but nobody had ever heard of it, and he was just as mystified about what was going on. The authorities put him kind of under a house arrest and put him up at a hotel, but the next day he had mysteriously disappeared. There's been other similar cases like this. Where people just seem to, not only disappear out of this reality, but appear as well. You think about all these cases that you hear about somebody being found, say, like sitting in a fast food restaurant, who has no memory of who they are, where they came from. Face gets plastered all over the newspaper. Now the internet, nobody's able to identify him ever. So, is this somebody that's just, found a way, which is extremely difficult nowadays, to change their identity, maybe get away from the wife and horrible kids, and just claim that they have amnesia? Or are we dealing with somebody who literally stepped through a hole from another reality and end up lost in ours?
That's a possibility, and that's where some of our missing people can be going to. Again, they stepped in, ended up there too. But there's been cases where people have been missing for 2-3 years, and all of a sudden they appear, and they don't even know where they've been for the last couple of years. Let alone they're wearing the same clothes they wore when they disappeared. That is kind of interesting too, and there's been cases like that.
There's an interesting story, and it's hard to tell whether or not it actually happened, but this involved a gentleman who was playing with an orchestra in Vienna, and the one evening after they were finished. And he was a percussion player, so he had a drum with him. He left the theater with his drum, walked out, I guess, the stage door, and disappeared. Was never seen again. I guess a researcher discovered an interesting story out of Australia that happened. Really, it wasn't too long after, maybe even before. Now I'm thinking about it. this incident where these sheep herders out in the middle of nowhere in Australia, out in the bush, sitting around a campfire, and all of a sudden, out of the darkness comes this guy dressed in a tuxedo, carrying a drum. No idea who he was or how he got there. And that, unfortunately, like I said, this took place, I think, back in the 1930s. There was never any follow-up. So it's an interesting story. Whether or not it can be verified or not, that's another thing. But it's a good representation of other stories that have happened throughout the years that have been verified of people who. Some way or another are able to either find themselves teleported, or is it time travel, or maybe a little bit of both.
I think so. Have you seen the Charlie Chaplin film that was made in the 1920s, where a lady was looking like she was talking on a cell phone?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know. It was from outtakes from one of the movies that he was shooting, which fortunately had been saved. I mean, it does look like she's talking on a cell phone. Of course, who would she be talking to? And if it was a cell phone, there were no cell phone towers back then. You know, so I mean, it's a fascinating piece of film. You know, there's another one that was filmed later than that. I think this one was like in the late 1940s that showed people coming out of this factory, and there is a woman who is holding something up to her head and appears to be talking like a cell phone, black and white footage. And again, if this was a cell phone, who was she talking to, and how was it getting out? Because there were no cell phone towers then. So,
but it could have been some other type of telecommunication device that resembles a cell phone. You know, I've had people come back and say, well, you know, that it was a hearing aid. People, right. Well, people don't realize back in the 40s, back in the 20s, a hearing aid required tubes. They were a big device. They weren't something you could put in your pocket, let alone hold in your hand. Let's face it, even the batteries to power those would have been big. So let's rule out it's not a hearing aid. So I don't think it's a makeup case. And some of these films that have been really gone through and tested, okay, like Kodak checked that one out originally from Charlie Chaplin back, I think in 23 or 27, whatever year that was, and said that nothing was ever doctored on that. So I mean, whatever that she was talking on was some type of telecommunication device. But maybe she was from the future then, and it was a device for that. We think always, cell phone. Well, it doesn't have to be a cell phone. It could be a Captain Kirk type of device. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, exactly. It's and I've done this myself. You know, gone through looking at old films that show people on the street just looking to see if there's anything out of the ordinary, and I guess so. Obviously, there are people who spend a lot more time than I have doing this because there have been some like these two cases that we just talked about, some interesting anomalies that have cropped up. I don't know if this is would be representation of a time traveler, but there was in England there was a city councilman who was out walking on the street in the city that he lived in one it was like a Saturday afternoon, and coming towards him down the street in the crowd was this woman who was dressed very, very oddly. She was wearing like almost like a silver-colored tutu. Her facial features were rather odd and elongated. He said that her eyes were bigger than normal, and that she was, as she would walk, she had her hands out in front of her, and was kind of like making circular motions in front of her. And he said she looked like she was a tourist taking in all the sights, even though there was something about her that he said did not look quite human. That's the way he described her. He said she was just human-looking enough, but the way that she was dressed, her facial features, even the type of makeup that she was wearing, and she was just walking along, just taking in all of the sights. And he walked past her, and then it was just like, wait a minute, what did I just see? And then turned around and tried to find her again, but she had disappeared into the crowd. So the story has circulated as like, oh well, he saw an alien, but could this be a time traveler, a tourist, so to speak, just like he thought? Sometime in the future, could there be a whole industry of tourism to various times in the past, for, I suppose, those who are rich enough to be able to afford it.
It's a possibility. That is, so much, something that stuck in my head. You mentioned about time travelers, going out in space and coming back, that the Earth would, change by 1,000,000 years or whatever, okay? Think about it. There is people who would do that because there was a waiting list to go to Mars, and Mars would be a one-way ticket. So,
oh, sure. Oh, yeah. Well, and it would be the same way, with interstellar travel. I mean, it's not outside of our current technology to be able to build a spaceship that could go, not the speed of light naturally, but I mean, one physicist I heard talking, I mean, he was saying that, even 20% of the speed of light would be fast enough to get us to somebody to another solar system within their lifetime, and then probably back again. But again, by the time they came back, 1,000,000 years would have passed on Earth, due to the time dilation effect. So, if you were going to have that kind of ability, you'd basically have to have a group of people who would be like nomads almost. That there would be no way that they could ever return in time to tell what they saw out there to the people, or really even the ancestors of the people who sent them out. It would be so far in the future that it wouldn't make any sense to even try to come back.
Why would they want to come back? What they'd be coming back to, the way our world is going to be, they probably wouldn't even want to come back, because they'd be coming back to what? Maybe a frozen planet or a water planet, or who knows, but it won't be anything that they were ever used to. They won't have any connections. If there is humanoids still on our planet, they won't have any connection to them. Now, it's
Planet of the Apes, so to speak.
It could, well, or lizards. Who knows what it could be? It doesn't have to be apes. But do you? We're going to go on break. Do you want to hang around for about another 15 minutes after break, or I'm more than
sure. Yeah, I can stay on a little longer.
Okay. Well, we're going to be on break. We'll be back in about 2.5 minutes. You're listening to Tim Swartz, James, who's been more than quiet, and myself on Night Dreams Talk Radio After Dark.
You thirst for some significance of the both dimensional kind. You enter a realm of spirit, of sight and sound and mind. Your radio is a cosmic doorway, and your psyche begins to spark. When you tune in to Gary Anderson and Night Dreams After Dark.